If you've ever wondered about the unsung heroes of World War II, the ones who worked in complete darkness, in waters so cold they could kill you in minutes, then you need to hear this story. If you're interested in real history, real survival, and the incredible ingenuity of ordinary men doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions, please subscribe to our channel. We upload stories like this every week, stories that deserve to be remembered. Now let's dive in. We worked in waters so cold that the moment your exposed skin touched them, you understood what it meant to be truly alone. That was our life, mine, and the men of the diving team at Scapa Flow, the fleet anchorage in the Orkney Islands, and later, anywhere the convoys needed us. We weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. We didn't carry rifles or fly planes. But every ship we brought back to life meant another convoy could sail, another delivery of food and ammunition could reach the front lines, and men, thousands of men, wouldn't starve or run out of ammunition in the trenches and on the beaches. That was the weight we carried every time we suited up. That was the reason we kept going back into those waters, even when we knew the risks. My name is James, and I was a heavy diving suit man. That means I wore the metal helmet, the Sieb Gorman equipment that weighed nearly 200 pounds with the lead-sole boots and the chest plate bolted down tight. It means I breathed air that came through a rubber hose from the surface, air that was pumped to me by men I had to trust with my life. It means I communicated with those men through a thin wire that ran alongside my airline through a series of coded tugs and pulls. One tug meant okay. 3 rapid tugs meant help me now. 2 sharp pulls meant I had something important to tell you. We developed a language without words, a conversation that happened in tension and release, in the vibration of rope against gloved hands. The first time I went down in waters near the Arctic, I wasn't ready, even though I thought I was. We're never really ready for something like that. The preparation started hours before in the tender. That's the small boat where the diving crew staged their operations. We had the pump man, who kept the air coming, who understood his equipment like it was part of his own body. We had the tender man, who managed the umbilical, the hose and line bundled together, our lifeline in every sense. We had the standby diver, fully suited and ready to go in after any of us if something went wrong. And we had the signals tender, the man who translated the tugs into information the rest of us could understand and act on. Every role mattered. Every man was critical. The Navy tried to rotate us, but the truth was the best teams stayed together. We learned how each person moved, fought, responded to pressure. The equipment itself was a marvel of engineering, built to keep a man alive in conditions that wanted him dead. The helmet was copper and brass, with a thick glass faceplate that allowed me to see, or try to see, whatever lay below. Inside, the air came in through a valve at the top of the helmet, circulated around my face, and exited through an exhaust valve that I could regulate with my gloved hand. Too much exhaust, and I'd lose air pressure, potentially getting the squeeze. That's when the external pressure crushes you against your suit like you're being wrapped in iron bands. Too little exhaust and carbon dioxide would build up in the helmet until I passed out, and nobody would know until I stopped responding to signals. That line between survival and disaster was incredibly thin, and we walked it every single day. The umbilical itself was a work of art. The air hose, the main line that delivered my oxygen, was about 3/8 of an inch thick, reinforced with a special spiral weave to prevent kinking. Wrapped around it was the lifeline, thinner but incredibly strong, used for communication and, if absolutely necessary, for hauling. The whole bundle would be passed over my shoulder and controlled by the tender man topside. If I needed to move laterally or deeper, we'd have a rhythm. I'd tug, he'd give me slack. I'd fin through the water, and he'd keep pace with my movements. It sounds simple, but in near-zero visibility, with currents that could push you sideways without warning, and with your mind already starting to get fuzzy from the cold and the pressure, coordination was everything. The suit itself was rubberized canvas, with canvas legs and arms, and brass cuffs at the wrists and neck that sealed against the helmet with a special locking collar. We called it the suit, but really, it was more like a personal pressure vessel. Under it, we wore multiple layers, long johns, extra sweaters, heavy wool socks. Even with all that, the cold would find its way in. The water around the Arctic wasn't just cold. It was a living thing that pulled heat from your body with deliberate, patient cruelty. We had men who'd been down for 40 minutes and come up with their hands completely numb, unable to feel anything for hours afterward. We had men whose fingers started turning black from frostbite, even inside the gloves. The Navy tried to limit our bottom time, but sometimes the mission didn't care about limits. Our first major operation of that winter was at the entrance to Kola Inlet, near Murmansk. The Soviets were desperate for supplies, food, weapons, ammunition, anything that could help them hold the line against the German advance. But German U-boats were hunting the convoys, and the Luftwaffe was constantly attacking. Ships were going down regularly, and some that survived the initial attacks were damaged, taking on water, struggling to stay afloat. One of these ships, a cargo vessel named the Harewood, had rammed a rock leaving harbor and torn open her bottom. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but was significant enough that she couldn't make the return journey without repairs. Our job was to patch her underwater, to make her watertight again, so she could be brought into harbor for more extensive work. We arrived at the site on a gray morning when the lights seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, filtered through low clouds that pressed down on us like a ceiling. The water around us was dark, not dark like night, but dark like the absence of light itself. There was ice forming on the edges of the harbor, and the air temperature was so far below freezing that the moisture from our breath would crystallize instantly. We could see our breathing, watch it turn solid in the air. I remember thinking, if we can freeze the air we breathe, what will the water do? The Harewood was moored with temporary patches on her damaged section, canvas and wood, held in place by cables, just enough to keep her from sinking completely. But that wouldn't hold for the journey back. We needed to do a permanent repair. That meant one of us would have to go down, assess the actual damage beneath the waterline, and make the decision about what kind of patch we'd use. I was selected for the initial inspection dive. As the tender men began dressing me, helping me into the suit, checking all the seals, bolting the helmet into place, I felt the familiar mixture of fear and purpose. The helmet came down over my head with a sense of finality. The lights in the world suddenly narrowed to what I could see through the faceplate. I tapped the glass twice, our signal that I was ready. The pumpman Davies started the air, and I felt the first breath, cold and slightly metallic, filling the helmet. The airline began to pulse with life. "Ready to go, James?" That was Thompson, the signals tender, speaking to me through the speaking tube, a secondary tube built into the setup that allowed us to communicate more clearly when we needed to discuss something important. "Ready," I said, and my voice sounded strange to me, echoing inside the helmet, contained in my own small universe of air and brass. They guided me to the ladder. The suit was heavy, phenomenally heavy, and as I descended, each rung of the ladder became a battle between the weight pulling me down and the water's increasing pressure pushing back. My ears began to hurt almost immediately. We're trained to equalize pressure, but it's never entirely comfortable, never entirely safe. Pop your ears wrong, and you risk rupturing the eardrum. At 10 feet down, I could still see the surface, a wavering, uncertain line of lighter gray above me. At 15 feet, the world became monochrome. At 20 feet, it became something else entirely, a realm of shadow and suggestion where shapes became uncertain, and the mind started playing tricks. That's when the real cold hit me. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel on land, where you can shiver and run around and generate heat. This was a cold that seemed to emanate from the water itself, a fundamental cold that sapped heat from your core, making you question whether you'd ever been warm at all. I was working blind for the most part. The visibility was maybe 5 feet at best, and even that was a generous assessment. I had a flashlight, a special underwater torch powered by saltwater batteries, but the beam seemed to be absorbed by the water almost immediately. I was descending along the hull of the Harewood, my hand trailing along the rough surface, feeling for the damage. My fingers were already stiff inside the rubber gloves, and the sensation of touch was becoming numb. About 30 feet down, I felt it, a jagged rent in the metal, rough edges where the rock had torn through the hull plating. I could feel the water seeping through it, a different temperature from a surrounding sea, carrying a sense of danger. I moved along the damage, getting its dimensions, trying to understand what we were working with. The tear was about 6 feet long, and maybe 3 feet high at its widest point. Not the worst damage I'd seen, but significant enough that a simple canvas patch wouldn't hold. I tugged the line 3 times, the signal for "I need to communicate." I felt the response tug, almost immediately, Thompson telling me he was receiving. Then I began a rhythmic series of tugs and pulls, our coded system for describing what I was seeing. By the time I finished, they knew we'd need a box patch, a more complex repair that involved using corrugated plates and carefully positioned timber to distribute the weight of the water pressure across a larger area. The journey back to the surface felt longer than the descent. My air was getting thin, not critically so, but enough that I was aware of it. The pump man was pumping harder to keep up with my consumption, and I could feel the change in the air pressure in my helmet. I ascended slowly. This was critical. Come up too fast and nitrogen bubbles form in your blood, a condition we call the bends. It can kill you or cripple you for life. We had protocols for this, mandatory safety stops, but we all knew people who hadn't followed them carefully enough and paid the price. Breaking through the surface was like being born. The light, suddenly, was overwhelming. The air I breathed tasted of the oil they used on the pump. My hands were shaking, partly from the cold, and partly from the adrenaline crash of the dive. But we had information. We knew what we were dealing with. The next morning, we began the actual repair. 3 of us would be working, myself, a man named Collins who was the best welder we had, and a younger diver named Shaw who'd only been with us for about 6 months. My role was to position the corrugated box patch and secure the timber backing. Collins would be doing the welding, underwater welding with waterproof electrodes, a technique that still amazes me when I think about it. The electrodes were specially treated to resist the water, and the arc of electricity would jump through the water itself to create the weld. It was dangerous and delicate, a procedure that required absolute precision. Shaw's role was to assist, to handle tools, to watch for problems, to be the extra set of hands and eyes that might mean the difference between success and disaster. Shaw was young, maybe 20 years old, but he had the right temperament for the work. He was calm, methodical, and he didn't panic under pressure. We needed people like that. The second dive happened in the afternoon. The water temperature had actually dropped further, if that was even possible, and the ice forming at the harbor's edge had extended outward. I remember thinking that winter itself was trying to stop us, that the whole Arctic was conspiring to prevent us from doing this repair. I descended with the first section of the corrugated plate, my arms feeling weak from the cold exposure of the previous dive. The metal was stinging cold even through the suit. Positioning the plate against the damaged hull was like trying to solve a 3-dimensional puzzle in the dark. I had to align it perfectly with the torn section, positioning it so that the damage was at the center of the reinforced area. My hands were working, but they were also starting to betray me. The numbness had spread from my fingertips up to my wrists. I was having trouble feeling what I was doing, relying more on sight, limited as it was, than on sensation. The timber bracing came next. Long wooden beams, treated to resist water damage, had to be positioned on the outside of the hull to distribute the water pressure. Imagine trying to do carpentry while wearing heavy gloves, working in near-complete darkness, while your body is slowly shutting down from the cold. Now imagine that if you make a mistake or if something goes wrong, the patch could fail and the ship could sink. That was the reality of our work. I was about 2 hours into the dive when I felt something sharp catch on my suit. A piece of jagged metal, probably debris from the damaged hull that I hadn't noticed before, had hooked into the canvas. My first instinct was to pull away, but in diving, you never panic. Panic is what kills you. Instead, I moved slowly, trying to assess the situation. The suit wasn't torn, the canvas was still sealed, but I was caught. I couldn't move backward, and I couldn't move forward. I tugged the communication line. 2 sharp pulls, the signal for attention. I waited, feeling my air supply, counting my heartbeats. The response came almost immediately. Then I began the complex series of signals to tell them what was happening. The meaning came through, essentially, I'm snagged, don't pull. They'd understand. The worst thing to do in this situation would be for the tender to try to pull me free by yanking on the umbilical. That would do more damage, potentially rip the suit or tangle me further. I reached down, and the movement was agonizing, like moving through concrete, and worked my fingers under the sharp edge of metal. I had to shift my body position, work carefully, all while feeling my air supply, and my body heat steadily declining. This was where training took over from thought. I'd done this before, not in the Arctic and not quite this dire, but the principle was the same. Slow movements, methodical thinking, no panic. It took me maybe 5 minutes to work myself free, but it felt like hours. When I did, and I felt the suit separate from the metal, there was a moment of such profound relief that it almost made the rest of the situation seem manageable. Collins went down next. His job was to weld the corrugated plate directly to the hull, a connection that would be strong enough to hold the patch in place against the pressure of the water. Welding underwater is an art form. The water conducts electricity, which seems like it would make the process impossible, but waterproof electrodes create an arc that essentially boils away the seawater in its immediate vicinity, creating a pocket where the weld can form. It's like fighting against the ocean itself with electricity and metal. From the surface, we could see flashes of light coming up from below, the welding torch firing as Collins worked. The watching was almost harder than the doing. You're waiting, hoping that everything is going right, that nothing goes wrong, that the person you sent down comes back up. I won't lie, every dive felt like a gamble with the odds against us. When Collins surfaced, his first words were, "Bloody hell, it's cold down there." That was Collins' matter of fact, focused on the practical. But he reported that the first weld had taken, that the plate was holding position. We had hope. We had a chance. It took 3 more dives over 2 days to complete the patch. Each dive took a piece of us, feeling that didn't come back for hours, heat that never seemed to return, a growing awareness of how much the cold was affecting our performance. But it worked. The patch held. When we brought the Harewood back into harbor and they were able to bring divers down to inspect our work, it was still there, still sealed, still doing its job. As we pulled away from the harbor, heading back to Scapa Flow, I watched the damaged ship sail out behind us. She was going to make it. The supplies she carried, food for the Soviet soldiers, ammunition, medical supplies, were going to reach the front. It wasn't a direct line, not like firing a gun or flying a bombing run, but it was real. The work we'd done, the cold we'd endured, the risks we'd taken, it mattered. But there were other days when the situation was much worse. We operated out of various locations, but Scapa Flow was our main base. From there, we'd be called out to work on convoy escort vessels, damaged cargo ships, even some military vessels when the naval authorities needed something fixed urgently. The Atlantic was where the U-boat war was most intense, but the Arctic waters were different. They were colder, more isolated, more unforgiving. And the stakes were just as high. One convoy run stands out in my memory, not because it was unusual, but because it represented the culmination of everything we did, all the pieces coming together under pressure. We had reports of a damaged British minesweeper limping back to harbor. She'd hit something, officially, the damage report said she'd struck debris, but we suspected it was a mine that had failed to detonate. Either way, her hull was compromised enough that she was taking on water. She couldn't make harbor on her own. She needed us. The tender crew prepared us quickly. There was urgency in the movements, efficiency in the preparation. We knew what was coming. The water was even colder than usual. I found out later it was about 5 degrees Celsius, which is well below freezing, and the ice in the harbor meant we had to work in a narrow channel where rescue would be complicated if something went wrong. I was the first diver down. The minesweeper was a smaller vessel than the Harewood, which meant the damage was more critical. If we couldn't seal it, the ship would go down, and the crew, sailors who'd been through battles, U-boat attacks, the entire horror of modern naval warfare, would be lost. The pressure of that knowledge was as heavy as the diving suit. The damage was worse than expected. It wasn't a simple hole. It was a line of ruptures where something, we determined later it was a piece of unexploded ordnance, a mine or shell or something equally deadly, had raked along the hull, opening multiple seams. Water was pouring in. The ship was settling lower in the water every hour. This required a different approach. Instead of a single box patch, we need multiple patches carefully positioned and welded, working like a coordinated system. It was the most complex underwater repair we'd attempted in the Arctic. We had maybe 8 hours before the ship would be too compromised to work on, before the pressure differential and the rate of water ingress would make any repair impossible. What happened next is seared into my memory not because it was dramatic. It wasn't, not really, but because it was relentless. We worked. All of us. I was down for 40 minutes, working on the first patch, my hands barely functional, my core temperature dropping despite all the layers. They brought me up, did my decompression, got me warm as much as possible. Then Collins was down, then Shaw, then I was going back down. The water got colder with each dive. Or maybe it was just my body getting more depleted. It's hard to separate the objective reality from the subjective experience when you're that cold, when you're that stressed. All I know is that we were working against a deadline, and the deadline was being imposed by the sea itself. We got 3 patches in place and sealed. Collins had welded all of them, and his hands were shaking so badly when he came up the last time that he couldn't hold a cup to drink hot water. Shaw had been helping, fetching tools, managing equipment, and somewhere in the process, the young man had found reserves of courage he probably didn't know he had. The minesweeper stayed afloat. Water was still getting in. We weren't miracle workers, and neither was our equipment, but was getting in slowly enough that the ship's pumps could handle it. She made harbor. The repairs held long enough for the Navy's engineers to work on a more permanent solution. We never learned the full story of what happened to that crew afterward, whether they made it home, whether they survived the rest of the war. We learned not to ask questions like that. The work was the important part. The patching, the sealing, the making watertight of things that should have sunk. We were working with consequences, with the knowledge that our failure meant loss of life, but also with the knowledge that our success meant survival, not just for the ships, but for the people on them, and for the people on the other end of the supply chain who were depending on those ships to reach them. There were dangerous moments that had nothing to do with the cold. Once, Shaw was down inspecting a section of hull, and his line caught on a piece of wreckage, something sharp and corroded from a previous ship that had been wrecked and had sunk. The current, which had been manageable earlier, picked up suddenly, and the line twisted. Shaw was caught in a way that I'd never seen before, tangled and potentially in danger of the umbilical being cut by the jagged metal. I remember the signals that came through from Shaw. Not panic, but urgency. Thompson was immediately coordinating, checking with the standby diver. But I was already moving. I said I was going down, and before anyone could object, I was in the water. The descent felt faster than it actually was. Shaw was about 40 feet down, and I could see him through the murk, a metallic figure caught in a nightmare of corrosion and rust. His movements were controlled but stressed. I could tell from his body language that he was aware of the danger, but not panicked. I descended to him carefully, conscious of my own air supply, and the time I had. The wreckage was more complex than the signals had indicated. It wasn't just Shaw's line that was caught. He'd been pushed into a section of hull plating that was twisted and sharp. One good move in the wrong direction, and he'd tear his suit. I worked slowly, carefully, using hand signals to tell Shaw to hold still. The wreckage had to be handled, the line had to be freed, and it all had to happen without creating new problems. I was working without instruments, without the ability to get better light, or a better angle. I was using my hands and my training, and my hope that I wouldn't make things worse. It took maybe 10 minutes. When Shaw's line came free, I felt a profound sense of relief. I signaled him to ascend, and I stayed below a few minutes longer to make sure there was nothing else tangled, nothing else that could catch when we tried to bring him up. Shaw came up ahead of me, and was already halfway through his decompression stops by the time I surfaced. When he came all the way up, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me and nodded. That was all the communication we needed. These were the moments that defined the work. Not the successful repairs or the ships that sailed out behind us, though those mattered. These were the moments of crisis, of one another, of trust that had been earned over months of shared danger. The winter wore on. We did other repairs, other patches, other desperate measures to keep damaged ships moving. Some patches held. Some didn't, and sometimes we found out later that a ship had gone down despite our efforts, sometimes because our patch had failed, but more often because they'd encountered enemy action or natural disaster on their journey. We learned to carry that weight and not let it crush us. There was a rhythm to it all. Preparation, descent, work, ascent, decompression, warming up, recovery, and then again. The cycle would repeat every day or so, depending on the work that needed doing and the conditions. The cold never got easier. Your body never adapted. You just got better at ignoring it, or perhaps you just accepted that this was the new baseline, that numb and cold was now the standard state of existence. Shaw asked me once if I thought what we were doing was worthwhile. We were in the warming tent, drinking hot tea laced with rum, which the Navy provided for exactly this purpose, to help restore core temperature and morale, and he was looking at his hands, which were still partially red and swollen from cold exposure. I told him that I thought it was. I told him that every ship we patched meant every person on that ship had a chance to survive, to go home, to do whatever it was they wanted to do after the war ended. I told him that the supplies those ships carried fed people, kept armies in the field, gave humanity a chance. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "My brother is in North Africa. Probably not eating very well. Maybe one of the ships we patched is carrying his rations." That's what kept us going. That specific, personal connection between the work we did in the cold water and the lives of people we'd never meet, but who were depending on us. Years later, after the war was over, I ran into Collins in a pub in Edinburgh. We didn't say much. Soldiers and sailors aren't usually great at talking about things, but we sat together and had a drink, and neither of us had to explain why. He'd gone back to his civilian work, repairing ships in a normal harbor, without the cold and without the pressure. But I could see in his hands that still shook slightly sometimes, though not as badly as during the war, that the experience had changed him. It had changed all of us. The work itself was revolutionary, though we didn't think of it that way at the time. The techniques we developed for underwater repair in extreme conditions became part of the permanent knowledge base of diving work. Welding underwater became a refined technique. The protocols we developed for communication and safety, the understanding of how to work together in conditions where traditional teamwork was nearly impossible, these became standards that persisted long after the war ended. But more than the technique, it was the human element that mattered. We learned that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when the stakes were clear and the purpose was obvious. We learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but rather the decision to move forward anyway, to do the work that needs doing, to trust that the person next to you has your back and that you have theirs. I think about those times often. I think about the cold, certainly. It was the defining sensory experience of that period of my life. But more, I think about the men. Thompson, who never failed to give me clean air and clear signals. Davies, whose understanding of the pump and whose steady hands kept us alive. Collins, whose steady nerve allowed him to weld in conditions that would have broken most people. And Shaw, the young man who learned to work in an environment that would have sent most people fleeing. We were working to keep ships alive. But in doing so, we were keeping people alive. The sailors who crewed those vessels, the soldiers who received the supplies, the civilians who depended on those supplies reaching their destinations, all of them were connected to what we did in the deep, cold water. The work continues even now. There are still divers going down into cold water to fix things that need fixing. The war is long over, but the ocean hasn't changed. It's still cold, still dangerous, still demanding. The techniques have improved, the equipment is better, but the fundamental challenge remains the same. Human beings working against the elements to accomplish something necessary. If you want to understand World War II, you can read the histories, study the battles, learn about the strategy. But if you really want to understand it, talk to the people who were there. Talk to the people who did the difficult, unglamorous work that made the famous battles possible. Talk to the supply workers, the repair crews, the engineers, the ordinary men who did extraordinary things because it needed doing. That's what I'm hoping this story does, gives a moment of recognition to the divers who worked in impossible conditions to keep the convoys moving, who risked their lives in the cold water so that supplies could reach the people who needed them most. And if you've listened this far, if you've followed the story all the way through, I'd ask you to do one thing: subscribe to our channel. We tell stories like this every week, stories of the ordinary people who did extraordinary things during the Second World War. Stories that deserve to be remembered, that might otherwise be forgotten. By subscribing, you're helping us keep these stories alive, helping us ensure that the people who served, the visible heroes and the unsung workers, are never forgotten. Thank you for listening, and please join us for the next story.